The first blow didn't come from a fist, but from a single, pristine sheet of paper sliding across the granite countertop. The same granite I'd picked out with my husband Samuel on a rare sunny afternoon years ago. My son Julian wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a point over my shoulder as if watching a ghost only he could see. "$600 a month, Mom," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth I remembered from his childhood. "Sabrina and I think it's more than fair. You're not exactly five-star tenant material at your age." From the living room, where she was scrolling on her phone, my daughter-in-law's voice dripped with a cloying, venomous sweetness. "Think of it as your contribution, Eleonora, for the air you breathe in our house. The ghost of your husband can't pay the mortgage after all." That was it. The moment the world fractured. I stood in the heart of the home I had built, in the kitchen, where the scent of Samuel's favorite cedar logs still seemed to linger in the floorboards, and I was rendered a trespasser. 40 years ago, Samuel and I had driven the first stake into this patch of Oregon soil, overlooking the moody gray expanse where the Columbia River meets the Pacific. We designed the house ourselves, with wide windows to catch the fleeting sun and a foundation strong enough to withstand the fiercest coastal gales. I'd hammered nails until my thumbs were bruised, planted the wind-battered rhododendrons that now guarded the porch, and chosen the deep forest green for the trim. Every beam, every floorboard, every pane of glass held an echo of our life together. After Samuel passed, the silence in the house became a physical weight. Julian and Sabrina had suggested I move in with them, framing it as a kindness. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom. The house is too big for you." I'd agreed, believing it was a chance to mend the frayed edges of our family, to feel the warmth of life again in the hollowed-out chambers of my heart. The house was certainly large enough. I thought they would welcome the help. I cooked, I cleaned, I mended the fences the winter storms knocked down. I thought we were weaving ourselves back into a single tapestry, but the weave began to unravel, thread by quiet thread. It started suddenly. They asked me to move from the master bedroom, my bedroom, into a smaller guest room, to give them more privacy. Then little sticky notes began appearing on food in the refrigerator. Julian's, Sabrina's. Soon I was no longer included in their dinner plans. "We're grabbing a bite out," they'd say, or "We already ate." The cold shoulder became a wall of ice. Then came the talk about money. "Things are just tight right now, Mom," Julian explained one evening, the rehearsed apology sitting awkwardly on his face. "The utilities, the property taxes, the groceries, it all adds up." I understood. I wasn't naive to the costs of living. I began handing over my entire Social Security check each month, assuming it would cover my share and then some. It was a sacrifice, leaving me with nothing for myself, but I believed it was for family. Apparently, it wasn't enough. A week later, Julian presented the rental agreement. $600 a month. Not a discussion, not a plea for help. It was a sterile corporate demand, delivered in the sanctuary I had created. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. The shock was too profound. A deep internal freeze that numbed everything else. I stared at the paper, my hand resting on a faint scorch mark on the counter from a Thanksgiving 20 years ago when I'd let the gravy burn while dancing with Samuel. I asked only one question, my gaze fixed on my son. "Was this your idea?" He flinched, a flicker of the boy I once knew, before he looked away. "It's something we both decided was necessary." "We." He meant her. I nodded slowly, the motion feeling disconnected from my body. That night, I lay in the sterile guest room staring at the ceiling. The familiar sounds of the house now alien and menacing, the groan of the pipes, the whistle of the wind through the eaves, They no longer sounded like home. They sounded like a cage. I ran my fingers over the silver frames on my nightstand. Our wedding day, a family trip to Cannon Beach, Julian's college graduation. Each memory now felt tainted, like a photograph left out in the rain. I thought of Samuel, of how we'd poured every spare dollar and every ounce of strength into this place, into giving our son a future, a foundation of security. We built this shelter so he would never know the cold fear of being without one. And now he was charging me for that very shelter. I wasn't family anymore. I was a line item in their budget, a liability. My worth had expired with my husband. The next morning, I signed the document, not because I agreed with its cruel premise, but because I needed time. Time to understand the depth of the rot. Time to see if the son I had raised was truly gone, or if he was just lost somewhere inside the cold, hollow man who stood before me. As I slid the signed paper back to him, a tight, triumphant smile touched Julian's lips. "Thanks for being so understanding, Mom." I simply nodded, but a voice inside me, a voice that sounded unnervingly like Samuel's, made a silent vow. "This is the last piece of paper you will ever hand me, and the last time you will underestimate me." Something inside me had not just cracked, it had calcified. It had turned to steel. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a reckoning. The first test came with the cold. The Oregon coast autumn had deepened into a damp, bone-chilling winter. The mist outside was a constant shroud, and the chill seeped through the walls. As I had done for 40 years, I went to the thermostat and nudged the temperature up just a few degrees, enough to quiet the ache in my joints and keep the creeping damp at bay. The next morning, a note was taped to the thermostat, a small plastic lockbox now installed over the controls. Sabrina's sharp, aggressive handwriting was unmistakable. "Do not adjust. The temperature is set. Electricity isn't a free-for-all." I stood there, my teacup growing cold in my hands, reading the words over and over. That evening, I approached Julian quietly. I asked him why I, the woman who had helped insulate these very walls, needed permission to be warm in my own home. Before he could muster a response, Sabrina's voice cut through the air like shattered glass. "Just because you gave birth to him doesn't mean you get a free pass for life, Eleonora." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I turned to look at her, searching for any sign of remorse, any flicker of humanity. There was none, only a cold, triumphant calculation in her eyes. "We pay the bills now," she continued, her voice rising with self-righteousness. "If you can't contribute more than your little check, then you don't get to decide how resources are used." I wanted to scream. I wanted to list every meal I'd cooked, every floor I'd scrubbed, every dollar I'd handed over. I wanted to demand to know when love and respect had been replaced by transactions. But I remained silent. I understood now. This was never about money. It was about power. It was about systematically stripping me of my place, my history, my identity within these walls. A week later, they moved me again. "The guest room is perfect for an office for me," Sabrina announced. "We fixed up the attic for you. It's much cozier." The attic was a glorified storage space, cramped under the eaves with a single small porthole window that looked out onto a gray sky. It was reachable only by a narrow, steep set of stairs. My queen-size bed, Samuel's last gift to me, wouldn't fit. They left it dismantled in the hallway. I spent that first night on a lumpy twin mattress, curled under a thin blanket, listening to the rain hammer on the roof just inches above my head. They were erasing me, not with loud theatrical cruelty, but with the quiet, methodical precision of an assassin. My life became a list of prohibitions. I wasn't to cook in the kitchen. They were meal prepping now. I had to ask permission to have my one friend, a widow from my book club, over for tea. Each rule was delivered with a veneer of polite reason, but each one was a chisel chipping away at the woman I used to be. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I was in the small garden patch by the side of the house, trying to salvage the frost-bitten herbs, when I heard Sabrina talking to a neighbor over the fence. Her voice carried clearly on the damp air. "Oh, Eleonora, she's fine, but honestly, she should have thought things through before signing the house over to us and then expecting a free ride for the rest of her life." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. Signing the taxes and mortgage paperwork while you're recovering? It just makes dealing with the bank easier. You're still on the deed, of course. I had trusted him. I was his mother. I had signed where he pointed, my hand shaking, my mind too clouded by fever and medication to read the fine print. Now, standing in the cold, I finally understood. That document wasn't a temporary measure. It was a weapon. They had used my moment of greatest vulnerability against me. But as the shock receded, it was replaced by something else, a cold, hard clarity. I had been a fool, yes, but I had not always been one. Before I was a wife and a mother, I had worked for 2 years as a paralegal in a maritime law office in Portland. I knew about paperwork. I knew that every transaction leaves a wake. And I knew that if my name had ever been on that deed, truly and legally, they couldn't just wish it away. That night, after they were asleep, I didn't go to the attic. I crept down to the study, to the old sea chest where Samuel had always kept our most important documents. It was made of dark, heavy oak, bound with brass. I lifted the lid. The familiar scent of old paper and cedar filled the air. I rummaged through the files, tax records, insurance policies, repair receipts. But the deed, the original certificate of ownership for this land, was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced my chest. But then I took a slow, deep breath. They could remove the paper from the house, but they couldn't remove it from history. The next morning, I told them I was going to the city to visit a friend. Instead, I took the bus to the Clatsop County Courthouse, a stern granite building that smelled of floor wax and history. I found the county clerk's office and requested the public property file for my address. The clerk, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, typed the information into her computer. "And your name?" she asked. "Eleanor Avance," I said. "I believe I'm a party to the property." She looked at her screen, her eyebrows knitting together. She typed some more. Then her expression cleared. She swiveled the monitor toward me. "Well, Mrs. Vance, you believe correctly." And there it was, a digital copy of a deed from 1984, signed by Samuel Vance and Eleonora Vance, establishing joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Below it was another document, the one I'd signed in the hospital. It was a sloppily prepared power of attorney, one that Miss Maud Finch would later call laughably unenforceable for transferring real estate. Critically, it had never been used to legally file a new deed. My name had never been removed because Samuel had passed his share, had automatically transferred to me. I was not a 51% owner. I was the 100% sole legal owner of the property. They had built their entire kingdom on a foundation of lies and a worthless piece of paper. "Could I have a certified copy of the original deed?" I asked, my voice miraculously steady. "Of course," the clerk said, stamping the printed document with an official seal. "Will that be all?" "Yes," I said, tucking the papers into my purse, my hand closing around them like a lifeline. "That will be all they need." I walked out of that courthouse and into the misty Oregon air, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt the steel in my spine. They thought I was a fragile old woman, easily confused and defeated. They had forgotten who I was, I was the woman who had built this house, and I had just found the master blueprint. I didn't go home and stage a grand confrontation. The time for words was over. The time for action had begun. I started packing, not frantically, but with a quiet, deliberate purpose. I packed 2 suitcases with only the things that held my soul. A few changes of clothes, my mother's jewelry box, the framed photo of Samuel in his fishing gear, smiling against the wind. I left the furniture, the dishes, the linens. They were just objects. The memories were mine to keep. As I wheeled my suitcases toward the front door, Sabrina saw me from the kitchen. She leaned against the doorframe, a smug, contemptuous smirk playing on her lips. "Well, well," she drawled. "Looks like someone finally got the hint. Took you long enough." She didn't ask where I was going. She didn't offer to help. She just watched, savoring her victory. Julian came down the stairs, his face a mask of indifference. His eyes met mine, but there was nothing there. He had already written me out of his life. I opened the front door and walked out, the quiet click of my suitcase wheels on the porch, the only sound. I didn't go far. I went to the sheriff's department in the next town over. The sheriff, Caleb Hayes, was the son of a man Samuel had worked with on the docks for 30 years. "I used to bring his family casseroles, Mrs. Vance," he said, his face a mixture of surprise and concern as he led me into his office. "What can I do for you?" I laid the certified deed on his desk, then calmly and precisely, I told him everything. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the document. He let out a long, slow breath. "Well, Eleonora," he said, his voice laced with a cold anger I hadn't expected, "what they're doing isn't just disrespectful, it's fraud. And charging the legal owner rent to live in her own home? That's extortion." He looked me straight in the eye. "They are, in plain English, trespassing." He picked up his phone and made a call. "Isolde, Caleb Hayes here. I've got a client for you, the kind you like." Miss Isolde Finch was known locally as the Osprey. She was a sharp, elegant woman in her 50s with eyes that missed nothing. Her handshake was firm, her questions precise. I met her that afternoon. "They never filed a new deed," she said, reviewing my papers with a thin, appreciative smile. "Amateurs. This is clean, Mrs. Vance. Very clean. We won't even need to go to court." "Not at first. I don't want them to know it's me," I said. "Not yet," she said, her smile widening slightly. "We'll file the petition for unlawful detention through a third party. Let them wonder which of their bridges they've burned." The legal machinery began to turn silently and efficiently. A formal notice of disputed ownership was served. It gave the current occupants, my son and daughter-in-law, 14 days to provide proof of legal ownership or face eviction. I waited. From the small, clean motel room I had rented, I imagined their confusion turning to panic. To them, it must have seemed like a bureaucratic nightmare, a ghost in the machine of the legal system. They had no idea the ghost was their own mother. They ignored the notice. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Isolde Finch handed me the final document, the formal eviction order. I picked up the pen and signed my name. Eleonora Vance, not as a mother, not as a victim, but as the sole rightful owner of the home I had built. My hand didn't shake. It was a quiet morning in early spring, the mist rolling off the Pacific. I stood across the street, wrapped in Samuel's old wool coat, the scent of cedar and sea salt clinging to it like a memory. At precisely 9 a.m., Sheriff Hayes's cruiser pulled into the driveway, followed by Mrs. Isolde Finch's sensible sedan. The knock on the door was loud, firm, and official. Julian answered, blinking in the daylight, his face clouded with confusion. "What is this?" The sheriff unfolded the document. "This is a legal notice of eviction. You are required to vacate the premises within 48 hours. Sabrina appeared behind him, her shrill shriek. "What the hell are you talking about? This is our house. Who filed this? Who is doing this to us?" That was my cue. I stepped off the curb. The sound of my heels on the pavement was slow, steady, and deliberate, a metronome counting down to the truth. They saw me as I reached the edge of the lawn. Julian's face went white. Sabrina's mouth fell open, her tirade dying in her throat. I stopped at the edge of the porch and reached into my purse. I pulled out one single piece of paper, the original deed. I held it up. "The woman you charged rent," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the still morning, "is the legal owner of this property." Silence. Utter, deafening silence. You can't do this," Julian finally spoke, his voice breaking. "I already have," I replied, my voice devoid of anger or triumph. It was simply a fact. Miss Finch stepped forward, her expression serene. "Your names are on the mailbox, but her name is on the deed. You had 14 days to contest the ownership claim. You chose not to. The law is quite clear." Sabrina began to sob, a theatrical gulping sound. Julian just stood there, his face slack with disbelief, looking like a little boy who had just been told the world wasn't flat. I turned and walked away without looking back. I didn't need to see their faces. This moment, this profound, earth-shattering silence, was louder than any argument. And for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath my feet settle and whisper, "Welcome home." The house is quiet now. It's a peace I had to earn back inch by silent inch. I wake each morning to the light filtering through the east-facing window Samuel installed. I planted a garden full of resilient coastal flowers, sea thrift and lupine that thrive in the salty air. The house breathes with me again. This was never about revenge. Revenge is a fire that consumes the person who wields it. This was about restoration. It was about remembering who I was before they tried to make me forget. Every floorboard in this house knows my footsteps. Every nail was driven by a love they couldn't comprehend. They tried to erase my legacy, but they failed to understand that a legacy isn't written on paper you can steal. It's built into the foundation. It's carved into the beams. It's the quiet strength that endures long after the noise has faded. One day at a local historical society meeting, I met a man named Elias. He was a retired lighthouse keeper with hands as weathered as driftwood and eyes the color of the sea just before a storm. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He listened to my story and then said, "A lighthouse doesn't fight the storm. It just stands. It holds its light." He didn't try to fix me. He simply saw me. We now spend our afternoons on the porch watching the ships navigate the mouth of the river. He brings me polished stones from the beach. I make him my husband's favorite apple crumble. It is not a grand, passionate romance. It is something far more precious, a gentle, quiet companionship, a shared peace, a new beginning. My story didn't end when the locks were changed. That's where it began. It bloomed in the quiet defiance of planting a new garden, in the silent strength of reclaiming what was mine, and in the gentle joy of discovering that it is never too late to be seen, to be valued, and to find a new light to guide you home. True strength isn't about the wars you win, it's about the peace you cultivate in the aftermath. And my peace, like the house I stand in, is built on a foundation that will never be broken.